The evening was shifting into night as Lauren Blake drove home. Her black Tesla glided smoothly down the well-paved road, the horizon painted in warm hues of orange and pink by the setting sun. Lauren had just wrapped up one of the most critical days of her career. The meeting with the FBI's senior members had gone well, and they had approved her reform plan aimed at tackling internal corruption. Her name echoed across the country as a symbol of progress, but she knew it was just the beginning of a long road ahead. Lauren's thoughts wandered to a conversation she'd had with her father when she was only 16. He'd told her, "People will doubt you not because of your words, but because of what they see before them. You must be stronger than that." Those words had become her life's mantra, repeated every time she faced adversity. Soft jazz filled the car's interior, creating a calm atmosphere, when her attention was caught by the flashing blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. A police car was approaching fast, and Lauren frowned. She hadn't broken any laws. Why was she being stopped? She carefully pulled over, turned off the engine, and glanced nervously at her side mirror. A young officer stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt. His movements were hesitant but carried an air of forced authority. Lauren had seen officers like him before, rookies trying to prove their worth. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration?" he said curtly as he approached her window. Lauren reached into her purse, keeping her movements deliberate. She knew that her calm composure was her strongest asset in situations like this. Handing over the documents, she looked up at the officer. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she asked, her voice even and composed. "You're driving an expensive car in a neighborhood where cars like this aren't common," he replied flatly, though tension flickered in his eyes. Lauren felt anger bubbling inside her. She'd encountered this kind of situation too many times before, but it never got any easier. "Excuse me, but is that grounds for a traffic stop?" she asked, her tone polite yet firm. The officer seemed taken aback by her response. He frowned, his hand shifting toward his holster as though it would grant him more confidence. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he ordered, avoiding her gaze. Lauren froze, her heartbeat quickening. But she didn't let it show. "You don't understand who you've just pulled over," she said, locking eyes with him. Her words hung in the air, the tension between them becoming palpable. Lauren stepped out of her car, feeling the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Her movements were deliberate and measured, knowing that every action she took was being scrutinized. On the sidewalks, a small crowd began to gather, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and unease. A few pulled out their phones, capturing what was quickly turning into a public spectacle. The officer seemed uncertain of his own intentions. His tense posture and darting gaze betrayed an inner conflict he was trying hard to mask. Lauren had seen this demeanor before, the kind of misplaced authority often used to compensate for inexperience. Her heart beat slightly faster, but her expression remained composed. She noticed his hand resting near his holster, a subtle but unmistakable display of control. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the collective attention of both the officer and the onlookers amplifying the tension. The sun had fully set, leaving the street bathed in the cold light of street lamps and car headlights. The scene felt surreal, almost staged, as if everyone present were unwitting actors in a high-stakes drama. A chill ran down Lauren's spine, but she held her ground, standing tall and unyielding. Her thoughts drifted to her past, to the day her father stood outside a police station, facing the same kind of gaze this officer now wore, a mix of fear and authority. Back then, it had cost her family everything. Today, she refused to let even the smallest mistake dictate her future. Lauren's eyes swept over the growing crowd. Their expressions ranged from concern to quiet anticipation. She could see that some were already forming opinions, judging both her and the officer. Others simply watched, waiting to see how this story would unfold. Inside, she felt a storm brewing, anger, frustration, and a deep sense of weariness. But she pushed those emotions aside. She thought of her daughter at home, knowing that her own actions now would set an example for the next generation. The glow of smartphone screens cut through the twilight. The officer took a step back as if preparing to say something, but hesitated. His growing tension was palpable, and Lauren knew he was losing control of the situation. She stood still, unmoving, like a statue. Fear and irritation threatened to creep in, but she held firm. A quiet mantra played in her mind: "You're not here to win an argument. You're here to show that justice is strength, not weakness." The crowd continued to watch. The cameras kept recording. And Lauren understood that this encounter was just the beginning of something far greater. The crowd on the sidewalk continued to grow. Quiet whispers and occasional murmurs filled the heavy silence surrounding Lauren and the officer. The glow of phone screens lit up her composed silhouette, framing her in an almost surreal spotlight. Lauren was acutely aware that every movement, every emotion she displayed would be captured. The officer, whose badge identified him as Jason Brown, nervously flipped through her documents. His face grew increasingly flushed, his gaze darting around as though seeking invisible support. His unease was as palpable as the cold evening air. While Jason pretended to scrutinize her papers, Lauren felt a simmering anger bubbling deep within her. She was accustomed to the world treating her with suspicion, whether for her appearance, her success, or her position, but that didn't mean she was willing to accept it quietly. Amid the hum of passing cars, her father's voice echoed in her memory. His words, like a steady anchor in turbulent waters, reminded her, "Keep your composure, Lauren. Always keep your composure. They lose when you rise above." Jason seemed to realize he wouldn't find anything suspicious in her documents, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He was clearly determined to end the situation on his terms, oblivious to the fact that he had already lost control. Suddenly, the static crackle of his radio broke through the tension. Lauren watched as his face contorted at the sound of a voice informing him that her name had flagged in federal databases. Jason seemed momentarily stunned, as though he couldn't fully grasp the significance of what he had just heard. His gaze returned to Lauren. Confusion and unease were etched on his face, but he tried to mask it with feigned authority. He opened his mouth to speak, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Lauren didn't respond. Her silence became her weapon. She let the stillness speak for her, leaving Jason to wrestle with his growing realization of the mistake he had made. The headlights of her car reflected off his face, illuminating every flicker of emotion. The crowd seemed to understand what was unfolding, their whispers fading into a tense hush. The radio crackled again, the voice now louder and more urgent. "That's Lauren Blake, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Repeat, cease all actions immediately." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Lauren watched as Jason slowly lowered her documents, his expression shifting to one of stunned recognition. The crowd froze. The cameras continued recording. Jason finally moved his hand away from his holster and took a step back. His face was pale, drained of the bravado he had displayed moments earlier. Lauren, maintaining her impeccable composure, stepped toward her car. She could see Jason fumbling to find words, but she wasn't about to give him the opportunity to speak. The house greeted Lauren with silence, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled her evening. She closed the door behind her, leaving her black Tesla parked in the driveway. The soft glow of a lamp in the living room and the faint ticking of the clock were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Placing her bag on the chair by the door, Lauren paused for a moment to steady herself. She ran a hand across her face, trying to quell the unease bubbling inside. Despite everything she had endured in her past, today's events left a particularly bitter aftertaste. The kitchen welcomed her with its familiar warmth. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, watching as tiny bubbles began to rise to the surface. A cup of tea had always been her refuge, her way of grounding herself on days when everything felt overwhelming. But tonight, even this ritual offered little solace. Her thoughts drifted back to the intersection, to the young officer's gaze, a mix of fear and a need to assert authority. She had seen that look too many times in her life. It was the look of someone unsure of their power, masking insecurity with aggression. It was a dangerous combination, one she knew well. Lauren sat at the table, cradling the warm mug in her hands. The heat seeped through her fingers but did little to thaw the cold weight in her chest. Her eyes rested on the stack of documents beside her. These were the materials for tomorrow's presentation to the committee, where she would defend her proposed reforms. She knew it would be a challenge, and after today's encounter, she anticipated even greater resistance. Her mind wandered to her childhood. She remembered her father, a schoolteacher, standing outside a police station after being wrongfully arrested. She had been too young to grasp the full scope of what was happening, but his words stayed with her. We don't choose the challenges we face, but we do choose how we respond to them. Now, she stood on the opposite side of that memory, not as the frightened daughter but as a woman leading the charge for justice. And yet, the feeling of helplessness still crept in from time to time. Her attention shifted to her phone, resting on the table. A notification lit up the screen, and without thinking, she picked it up. The message from an unknown number appeared suddenly, almost ominously. "Don't think you can change anything. We're watching you." A chill ran down her spine. Threats had become a part of her reality long ago, but each new one served as a reminder of the cost of her fight. She placed the phone back on the table, suppressing the unease that had started to rise. Lauren stood and walked to the living room. She knew tomorrow would bring another battle, perhaps even tougher than the ones she had faced before. But she was ready. There was no room left in her life for fear. The night was restless for Jason Brown. His small one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, usually a refuge from the stress of work, felt oppressively small. He sat at the kitchen table, holding a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of him were papers waiting to be completed for his report, but his mind was far from focused on work. Jason couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Lauren Blake. Her calm, steady gaze lingered in his thoughts, piercing through every attempt he had made to maintain a facade of authority. That gaze seemed to see right through him, exposing the cracks in his confidence. Since the moment he pinned on his badge, Jason had always viewed his duties as clear-cut. The law was black and white, but now he realized how blurry those lines could be. Today, he had seen how the power meant to protect could just as easily become a tool for intimidation. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the small town where he grew up. It was a place where fear of outsiders was passed down from one generation to the next. His father often said, "We protect our own. No one else will look out for us." Those words became a mantra for Jason, one that he now realized had not only shaped his beliefs but also confined them. He recalled how his father had insisted he enroll in the police academy. For their family, it was a symbol of success, a step toward rising above and earning respect. But Jason had begun to notice that instead of respect, he was met with distrust. He saw how his actions mirrored the very things he had always thought were wrong, but he couldn't admit it to himself. The phone on his desk rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his supervisor at the department. Jason answered, knowing he would have to explain everything that had happened. After a brief conversation, he set the phone down and buried his face in his hands. He now understood that the news about Lauren had spread throughout the station. His colleagues were not just discussing his actions but also the fact that he had confronted the head of the FBI. Jason realized his career was hanging by a thread. Inside, he felt a conflict brewing. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to find excuses and cling to his perceived righteousness. But another part pushed him to admit his mistakes and try to change. As the night dragged on, peace remained elusive. Jason opened his laptop to read up on Lauren Blake. He learned she was the first woman to hold her position, that her career had become a symbol of the fight for equality. He read comments under articles, where people called her an inspiration to thousands. Clenching his fists, he sat in silence. Everything he had believed now felt uncertain. He knew it was time to make a choice, to continue being part of a system that fed on fear, or to face his mistakes and try to make a difference. The next day, Lauren found herself under a spotlight. As soon as she stepped out of her house, she noticed a small crowd of reporters gathered at her driveway. Cameras, flashes, and rapid-fire questions. It was a scene she had grown used to, but today the pressure felt heavier. Since the intersection incident, her name had dominated headlines. She walked confidently across the driveway, holding a folder of documents. Questions rained down, about the reform, the officer, her reaction. Lauren didn't stop, didn't utter a word in response. Her focus was unwavering. An hour later, She sat in a conference room where the hearings for her proposed reforms were set to take place. The room was packed with commission members, lawyers, journalists, and a few activists who had managed to gain access. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a battle for the future of the system. Lauren stood at the microphone, her voice clear and firm. She laid out the essence of the reforms, emphasizing the importance of creating a system that served every citizen rather than oppressing them. Her words were backed by facts, statistics, and real-life stories. The reaction was far from unanimous. Some commission members expressed support, but others eyed her with skepticism. A police representative stood to ask a question, his tone unmistakably confrontational. Lauren felt the tension in the room rise. She responded without unnecessary emotion, focusing on the facts. Her calm demeanor and confidence began to shift the room's atmosphere. Even the most doubtful members started to listen. However, she knew her words were only part of the battle. The core issue lay not in the room but outside its walls. The system she sought to reform was deeply entrenched, and change would demand time and sacrifice. When the hearing concluded, Lauren felt drained, but it wasn't physical exhaustion, it was emotional. She stepped outside, where activists awaited her. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand. "Thank you for your work," he said quietly. Lauren nodded, accepting the gesture of gratitude, but she knew the fight had only just begun. That evening, she returned home to an unexpected surprise. On her computer screen was an email from Jason Brown. In it, he briefly but sincerely apologized for his actions. He admitted he had been wrong and asked if there was anything he could do to help bring about change. Lauren read the message several times. She knew it was a small step, but it was a significant one. Perhaps it was a sign that change was possible if everyone started with themselves. Evening once again found Lauren buried in work. Documents, articles, and data were spread across her kitchen table, which had become an impromptu workspace. The soft patter of rain against the window created an illusion of calm, but her mind was anything but. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention. Another message flashed on the screen. "We're not done. You're crossing the line." The threat was brief, but it was enough to make her heart skip for a moment. Lauren placed the phone down and took a deep breath. She knew these weren't empty words. Messages like this often followed her high-profile initiatives. But this time, the threat felt more tangible, as though someone really was watching her every move. Fear, however, had never been a reason for her to step back. She walked to the window, looking out at the wet street below, where a few cars passed under the rain. Her thoughts returned to Jason's email. His apology had seemed genuine, she could feel it. Yet she couldn't decide if she should trust someone who had so recently stood on the other side of this conflict. Deciding not to delay, she wrote her reply. Lauren suggested they meet to discuss how he could help. It was a risky move, but she believed change began with small steps. The next day, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Jason looked worn, but upon seeing Lauren, he straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. The tension was still there, though it began to fade as he spoke. Jason opened up about his struggles, both internal and external. He shared how he had grown up in a family where mistrust of others was commonplace. How he had joined the police force to earn respect but instead found himself trapped in biases that were only reinforced by his environment. His words were heartfelt, but Lauren listened in silence, analyzing every detail. She knew she was looking at a man on the brink of change. His confession was important, but it wasn't enough. She proposed that he join her reform program, where he could help train young officers, share his experiences, and work toward changing the culture within the department. It was a test, for both him and her. Jason agreed, though his voice trembled. It was the beginning of something new, for him, for her, and for the system as a whole. That evening, back home, Lauren opened her laptop to write a report. But her attention was drawn to the news, where her name was being mentioned in connection with the threats she had received. Her name had become synonymous with the fight against systemic corruption, and she realized she had become the face of change that could no longer be stopped. She closed the laptop, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride. The fight was far from over, but today, she had taken another step forward. The storm wasn't only brewing in the sky, It was closing in on Lauren's life. Threats, which at first seemed like mere echoes of discontent, were beginning to take a more serious turn. She could feel the tension in every step, as if the world around her had grown heavier. That evening, driving home, Lauren noticed a car in her rearview mirror that had been following her for several blocks. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She made several sharp turns, testing if it was a coincidence, but the car stayed on her tail. Her Tesla smoothly turned into her driveway, but instead of stepping out immediately, Lauren activated her security system via her phone, sending an alert about a potential threat. The car that had been following her drove past, but Lauren knew it wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, a phone call woke her. The voice on the other end was low and insistent. Her contact within the police department informed her that recent data leaks had exposed the names of several high-ranking officers involved in internal corruption. Among them was the name of the police captain who Lauren suspected was resisting her reforms. Immersed in her work, she felt the world around her tightening, as if invisible threads were weaving a web around her. The threat wasn't just in the messages, it was an organized campaign aimed at undermining her. Later that day, she received an invitation to a meeting organized by the police captain. Officially, it was scheduled to discuss her proposals, but Lauren knew it was a trap. Still, she decided to go. The conference room was filled with uniformed officers. The atmosphere was cold, almost hostile. The captain began the meeting with formal statements, but Lauren could sense the passive aggression in his tone. When it was her turn to speak, Lauren calmly presented her facts, backing them with evidence. Her words felt like a challenge. She could see the tension on some of the officers' faces, as if her resolve was threatening their status quo. After the meeting, she received another message: "You're making a mistake. No one can fight the system and come out a winner." Returning home, Lauren opened her laptop and found an email from Jason. He had forwarded her documents proving that the police captain was not only obstructing her reforms but was actively involved in corruption schemes. These materials could be the key to exposing the entire network. But Lauren knew that using this information would mean stepping into open conflict. Her actions would put not just her reputation but her life on the line. She took a deep breath, staring at the screen. She had no other choice. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Lauren expected. From the moment she woke up, she felt the weight of the entire system she was fighting against pressing down on her shoulders. She knew there was no turning back now. The documents Jason had provided were her ticket to exposing the entrenched corruption, but they also placed her life in even greater danger. The press conference hall was packed to capacity. Cameras, microphones, reporters, everything reminded her that this wasn't just a media event, it was her moment of truth. Behind her stood her allies and a few activists who supported her reforms. Lauren glanced at the documents on the podium. They symbolized not just evidence but her unwavering resolve. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. Her voice was calm yet firm. Lauren began by reiterating her goals: to create a system that protected citizens rather than oppressing them. Then she presented the evidence. Slide after slide, she revealed financial records, leaked communications, and connections between the police captain and various illegal schemes. The room erupted into murmurs, which quickly turned into animated discussions. Some reporters hurriedly took notes, while others were already calling their editors. Meanwhile, the police captain, who was present at the conference, maintained a facade of calm. But Lauren noticed his fingers nervously drumming against the table. His usual air of confidence had been replaced by tense silence. "This system can be reformed," Lauren concluded. "But to do so, we must acknowledge its flaws and have the courage to expose those who undermine it from within." The room erupted with questions, but Lauren remained composed. Her mission was clear: not to let emotions overshadow the core message. The battle, however, was far from over. Later that evening, Lauren received a message from her lawyer. It stated that the captain was attempting to accuse her of illegally using classified information. The move didn't surprise her. She had expected the system to defend itself. Meanwhile, her name flooded the headlines. Some media outlets supported her stance, while others sought scandalous angles in her actions. Social media was ablaze with debates, but Lauren chose not to follow them. Late that night, as she was about to go to bed, Jason called. His voice was tense but steady. He informed her that another officer had agreed to provide additional evidence against the captain. It was the first step toward triggering a chain reaction. Lauren knew more battles lay ahead. But this day marked a significant milestone. She had proven that no matter how formidable the system seemed, it was not invincible. At dawn, Lauren sat on her porch with a cup of hot tea in her hands. After the events of the previous day, the silence felt almost unfamiliar. The streets were empty, the air crisp, and the distant sound of birdsong broke the stillness. But inside her, there was no peace. Her phone, resting on the table, vibrated again, a constant reminder that the work was far from over. Messages, calls, emails, the wave of interest in her revelations hadn't subsided. Yesterday's press conference was just the beginning, and the road ahead promised to be even more challenging. The police captain, exposed in front of the entire country, was actively defending himself. Through his lawyers, he filed accusations against Lauren, trying to frame her actions as unlawful. But she had a plan. The documents she and her team had compiled were irrefutable. By midday, Lauren arrived at her office for a meeting with representatives from a federal agency. This meeting would determine the future of her initiative to launch a national reform program for law enforcement. The conference room was austere and formal. White walls, a long table with neatly arranged folders, and a group of people with unreadable expressions. But Lauren sensed a keen interest behind their composed demeanors. She delivered a presentation detailing how her program could transform police training and create a more transparent system. She spoke of accountability, the elimination of bias, and the importance of rebuilding public trust. When she finished, the room fell silent. Her words had resonated more than any questions could. Yet she knew the decision would not only be based on logic but also on political considerations. Late in the evening, driving home, Lauren turned on the radio. A talk show was discussing her initiative. The commentators' voices varied. Some supported her, while others argued she had gone too far. But even this was a victory. The issue was being discussed. At home, she received another piece of news. Jason had sent a new email. He shared that several of his colleagues were ready to publicly support the reforms. Lauren smiled. It was a small step, but a significant one. Sitting at her desk, she opened her laptop and began drafting a report for her team. Her fingers moved across the keyboard as her thoughts drifted back to the start of her journey. To how her father had taught her to never fear being strong, even when it felt like she was standing alone. She realized that the successes of today were just the first stage. The fight would be long, but she could already see the impact. She knew her efforts were not in vain. On the table lay her to-do list for the next day. But instead of feeling weary, Lauren felt inspired. She knew every small victory mattered. Glancing at the clock, she turned off the lights in her office. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and with it, a new chapter in her fight for justice.